Good afternoon everyone, I'm Ashna Singh. Welcome to Studio Art. I'd like to personally thank Nash India for their interest in covering the show, as well as the walkthrough with the artist Shivani Aggarwal. Her show titled Within Confines, which is at Studio Art on view till the 15th of Jan 2022. Do drop in, we look forward to seeing you. Shivani is a well-known visual artist from Delhi. She graduated from the Wimbledon School of Art in London. She's also a recipient of the Charles Walls Art Award in 2003, and her works are part of very good collections in India and abroad. She has been part of solo and group shows in the country as well as across the world. I'm now going to take you to Shivani for her walkthrough, the artist herself.
Hello, good evening, and I would start with this work. This work is called Seamless Curiosity, and all the works that are part of this show were created during the lockdown in 2020 and 2021, and this work is particularly done on canvas where I've stitched and painted. While being in the lockdown, I used to stare at the walls of my house and look at the intersections where the walls were meeting. Subconsciously, I began stitching these intersections onto the canvas along with the objects. I painted them along with the objects, and the objects and the intersections are part of this work. And objects are what I used to generally see in my house. I used to just look at them, observe them, and so this work was created with them.
Shivani, tell us a little more about the objects that you use. Your work has often, a kind of a safety pin or even a hammer.
Yeah, so these
thread roll.
Yeah, so these objects that I've used are quite often used in my work. They're part of my language, and here I've used them in another way where I've tried to kind of confine them into these boxes. These boxes that are stitched on the canvas. And I've used a little bit of paint, and here the meaning changes completely. And I've not been using the red thread, which has been very common to my practice. I begun using the white thread because I used to look at these white walls and these intersections of these white walls. So from this work, I was really excited while I was making these works. I was very excited to just stitch these boxes onto the canvas. Later, looking at this work, I wanted to actually translate these boxes into something more physical. So I worked on this work, which is called Holding Nothingness, where I've actually given these boxes a very physical form. I created these wooden boxes of different size and kind of entangled them together just the way I was entangling them in these canvases that you saw earlier. And very interestingly, when I began doing this work, I realized that these boxes are essentially empty. And that is where the whole idea of emptiness began, coming into my process. I began thinking of emptiness because of these empty boxes that I've made. I began thinking that, they hold nothing, and yet, they hold nothing at all. And it's interesting how they kind of talk about emptiness.
And I think also the empty spaces in your message you started noticing. In fact, even the corners in the lockdown, I started noticing those because there was so much of time.
Yes, exactly. There was so much of time and so much of these spaces
was so high.
Yes, and these spaces. I think there was no distraction, and there was no, there was our lives have become very simple in this time. Also empty. I used to see empty streets, empty homes, empty empty time. So all that kind of came around.
That began the measurement of life and worth.
Exactly. So from this work came this entire thought of emptiness, and I actually, thought of measuring it, and I began doing these drawings, which are just measuring instruments. So this one measures volume, this one measures pressure, this one measures time, and so on and so forth. This one measures weight. I was, through making these instruments, I was just trying to measure emptiness. So it's a very kind of a paradoxical situation, because this is actually measuring nothing. They are kind of dysfunctional objects which are measuring nothing, yet they were made thinking of measuring emptiness. Here in these works I have begun saying a little more about emptiness, where I've begun trying to define emptiness. What could it be? Where does it come from? Is it something from the past? Is it something that we've learned? Is it something that we have been, conditioned to believe in? Is it comfort? Is it protection? So I, began questioning, thinking about emptiness, and began questioning a lot of things as to where it could be coming from. Is it just physical, or is it mental as well?
Also, I think the lockdown probably did end up with people measuring so many things that they weren't necessary in life measuring, or parameters of success, parameters of wealth, parameters of happiness, parameters of emptiness.
Yes.
So which is how you probably noticed and went deeper into that part as well.
Also, this entire futility of a lot of things became aware of, that there were so many things in our lives that we were engaged in that were completely unnecessary, that we were really putting in so much of effort and time and brain into. So I think all that began surfacing, and that is actually where this work comes from, which is called The Creases I Iron. It's a work made in wood, in teak wood, and there is a little puzzle that you see here, and there are a lot of words that you can actually, so you can read. There is voice, and there is ego, and there are a lot of things that we actually deal with every day. We kind of iron these things every day, and this is kind of done in our empty, vacant time. So this work kind of talks about that. We are taking from here. There is this other work which is called How Do I Measure, and it comes from this little verse that I had written.
And that beautifully says, deep or shallow, enough or very little, real or an illusion, this emptiness. Does it define me? How do I measure?
Yeah, again, it talks about all the measurements we keep doing. All the measurements of, again, I sometimes think, is it, these are just empty measurements, you can't really measure a few things, like you can't measure success or intimacy or wealth or truth or worth, but we do it in our brain, we do it in our mind, constantly, focused on these things. We kind of measure, sometimes our wealth, worth, love, success, or sometimes the other person's. So all my sculptures actually come from these drawings or little paintings that I do, and it is from there that I kind of translate and define and kind of start saying more in my sculpture. So the earlier works that you saw were, I was talking about emptiness, where I was trying to define it in a more physical way. Here I began working with just threads, where I have made this mesh, which is kind of, it holds nothing really. The work is again called Holding Nothingness, which is because it is holding nothing. It's a mesh. It's just a mesh. Defined, it's sewn, sewn on canvas. During the lockdown, I was quite involved with crocheting or doing a lot of things with my hand because I could not go to my studio. So I used to sit at home and crochet copper wire. It's a very thin thread-like wire which I used to crochet, and for almost 6 months, every 3 hours a day, it was like my my little therapy that I would do. So I crocheted this huge work, which is copper wire, which is made out of copper wire. Again, it's an immersive work in the sense that one can walk inside it, and walk out of it also. Again, it kind of holds nothing really. it just hangs like this, and maybe could say that it was holding something, or maybe it holds nothing.
There's a little bit of
writing
that you did.
Where
on the side which says, "I kept weaving to hide, I kept weaving to drown, I kept weaving till it trapped me, I kept weaving until I could not weave anymore." You learned this during the lockdown through watching YouTube videos.
Yes, I learned this then because I just thought I wanted to do something really, being an artist all my life, I needed to work or do something, and I could not go to my studio, and I live in a tiny apartment, so I could not have painted at home. So this is the next best thing I could, work with, and I would just.
So it's your medium of thread in any case, it just comes naturally to you in any.
Yes, so I actually used to look at these YouTube videos which would teach crochet, and I just began working, and it kind of happened.
And have another video as well.
Yeah, and little did I know that it would take this size. I never thought that it's going to grow to such a huge size. It's almost like 15 feet by maybe 17 feet or something. There's a video inside, so I kind of recorded this whole process of crocheting, and this work talks about getting trapped. It's like we weave our own traps. So here the hand starts weaving, and it starts getting complicated. Slowly, it weaves into this huge huge crochet, and the hands get trapped inside it. So here I am actually talking about the whole thing that we weave our own traps. We make our own problems. We kind of make our own issues. We kind of it's very close to what the human beings have done. We keep making something which becomes so big that we get lost in it. It's just a simple thought that I converted in this video. So it's almost a 2-minute video, and
the text was written by Gopal, and it was curated by Studio Art. So you can speak a little about the text.
Yes, so this text is written by Gopal, as Ashna mentioned, and it really talks about emptiness and how emptiness becomes a space where you can actually discover yourself. Instead of looking at emptiness as a negative, here we are looking at emptiness as a space where one can discover, create, come up with something original, and a clear space which basically can be where all creativity can come from.
It's actually that clear space that gives us the clarity to move forward as well.
Yes.
Often we think if we are full of stuff, then and if we are empty, then there's a void.
Yes.
But we don't realize it's only when that emptiness comes is when we can actually fill it in with the more sensible and the wise things to do and how we want to step ahead.
Yes, very true, I think as well. That emptiness is required. I think the pandemic has taught us that emptiness is required.
And get rid of the clutter.
Get rid of the clutter and get rid of all the distractions that one needs. And it's quite interesting that I was reading in the morning something, and it read something biggest project you will ever work on is yourself.
Yes.
So that's really kind of sort of puts it together that we need that empty, clear space to think, to work, to ponder, to create.